joined now by Stephan Kinsella. He is a Houston area patent attorney and also a very well-known libertarian theorist, a leading anti-IP proponent. Stephan, thanks for joining me. How are you?
Hey, Albert, I'm doing well. I'm in fine fettle, as some people might say.
You're coming out with a new blog post that you've been working on, and this apparently has to do with your views on IP. I'm very looking forward to getting into it with you. But before we start, I just want to ask you, how would you describe the nature of this post? Is it something that is revolutionary, divergence from your original stream of thought, or is it a kind of a clarifying post?
It's just clarifying. I think over the years, as I've struggled to come to grips with intellectual property and how it relates to property theory, and to gain a deeper understanding of it. I mean, a lot of the insights I've had and that the way I think about property law seem fairly trivial and simple after the fact. And maybe they are, but sometimes you circle back to something simple. I've experienced in interminable debates since I started loudly proclaiming my opposition to IP law in like 1995. I've had so many debates with people and had so many experiences arguing the same things over and over and over and over and over again. And I've gradually seen ways of describing property rights, purpose of libertarianism, the nature of IP, and things like that, which have caused me to reformulate some of my arguments and the way I present them. So, for example, in my little monograph in 1998, 99, 2000 against intellectual property, which I still stand by pretty much everything in it. I'd probably tweak it a little now and I'd add some things to it. But it didn't occur to me to frame some of the arguments like I would now. I've come up with other ways of framing it that make more sense to me and that also seem to appeal to other people. And so what I was posting about on Facebook the other day, which you and a few other people picked up on, was like I had another insight. And a lot of these insights seem really trivial and people make fun of them. But to me, that's how I make incremental progress. It had to do with Bitcoin, okay? In a sense, the advent of digital technology, right? Basically the emergence of the internet in 1995-ish, and the advent of piracy and widespread digital file copying and all these things sort of caused a need for people to revisit their previous assumptions about property rights and intellectual property law, copyright and patent, because up until then, it wasn't a big issue and it only affected the material realm. But now we have the internet, which is the world's biggest copying machine, and people can copy left and right. And people that are used to saying that ideas are property are going to start calling that theft or piracy. And the government's going to crack down on it, and people are going to fight it. And then libertarians are sort of caught in the middle because they sort of sense that there's really nothing wrong with learning things and copying and, what we call competition on the free market, which requires emulating, seeing what other people are doing and emulating it. And yet that runs afoul of our previous sort of background notions of property rights, that you have a property right in ideas. So the intellectual property or the internet, the digital revolution required a rethinking or revisiting, I would say, of the foundations of property theory, which libertarians have done. And my impression, which is probably biased, is that by and large, most clear-thinking, principled libertarians today are extremely knowledgeable about the flaws of the IP mentality, and they're against it. So the digital revolution caused or required a rethinking of intellectual property. And then there's different ways you can explain the problems with it, right? You can look at the consequences. You can point to the history, the original purposes of it. You can point to the fact that it's largely a creature of state legislation, and you can point to problems with the state itself and legislation. So there's different ways you can approach that problem. And the purpose of what I'm talking about here is not really about IP, although it stimulates that thought. It had to do with Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin emerged, Bitcoin was like another event, like the advent of digital technology. Bitcoin has required a lot of Austrians and libertarians to sort of step back and rethink some of their foundational premises about the nature of money, the nature of property, and even intellectual property and things like that, contract theory. So,
Why? Can I interrupt for a second, Stephan?
Sure.
Why would you say that about Bitcoin and not, for instance, some of the digital advancements that preceded it? Bitcoin is unique in the sense that it's competing in the monetary realm, but we've had other digital advances that facilitated, widespread copying and things like that. Why do you think Bitcoin is special in the sense that it makes us think about our ideas a little bit more carefully?
Well, so just having the internet itself and having the ability to copy information, right? The digitization of information, caused this sort of this prospect of widespread, easily available dissemination of information, just copying information itself, which threatened the existing patent and copyright model, especially copyright. So that's why that caused that. All the other business models that were built upon the internet, I think, didn't really add anything new as a theoretical challenge. It was already there with the copyright problems. That basically there's a clash between the copyright interests, people that want to keep information contained, and people that are in favor of technology and the internet and digital information. There's obviously a conflict there, and that had to come to a head. And then libertarians, because we focus on ideas and principles, try to sort this out, try to figure out what the right side to be on is, et cetera. I think that battle's been won. I think we're cleaning up right now. There's a few stragglers, and I think that's a great thing. Left libertarians, anarchist libertarians, Rothbardian libertarians, principled libertarians, libertarians suspicious of legislation and the state, they're all pretty much against IP, which is a fantastic thing. So I think that battle's been won. We're mopping up right now. That we have a few straggling Randians, which are kind of dying out anyway. We had a few empirical minarchists who give a half-hearted, half-defense of IP, like Richard Epstein and David Friedman, sort of. Adam Mossoff is doing his best as an objectivist law professor to try to fix Ayn Rand's flawed view of copyright, but no one really thinks this is going anywhere. They've lost and they know it, and we're mopping up at this point. But when Bitcoin emerged, the thing is, libertarians are enthusiastic about Bitcoin. They've never been enthusiastic about the state's ability to stop copying of information, right? They were uneasy about that. That's what caused this sort of big debate. So libertarians, and especially the radical libertarians, have been enthusiastic about Bitcoin. And I think the first thing that happened was Bitcoin is like a new type of currency or money or whatever you want to call it or classify it as. And it really was not easy to be handled according to this traditional Austrian or free market view of money, because we've been analyzing the way money really did emerge in the world, which is through physical scarce commodities like gold or silver or other commodities. And so the economic theories that were built up around it were centered on that. I don't think Mises in his theory of money and credit could have imagined a digital currency like we have now, or whatever you want to call Bitcoin. So when it emerged, it sort of caused, or it made it necessary for people who want to think about this in principle terms, in clear Austrian terms, to revisit Austrian theory. What about Mises' regression theorem? How does that apply to this? Does money really have to be a commodity? Was Mises trying to prove by his regression theorem that only commodity could be money? And if he did, was he right? And can Bitcoin be money or not? And even if theorists say that it can't be money, you look around and it looks like people are using it as something like a money. So we have to explain that phenomenon. So that caused maybe a doubt or a need to revisit Austrian theory. Now that's economics. In terms of libertarianism, libertarians, especially a lot of the Rothbardians, have opposed fractional reserve banking in addition to fiat, money, the Federal Reserve type money, government money, for various reasons on normative or political or rights-based grounds. And I agree with all those. So then the question becomes, what is this new Bitcoin thing? How do we handle that normatively? So we came to a point, I won't say a crisis, but a point where this Bitcoin thing doesn't look like it's going away. We need to find a way to analytically handle it. We need to understand it economically and hopefully within Austrian economics and normatively. So you have all these proponents of Bitcoin in the libertarian and quasi-Austrian sphere, and yet everyone is talking about this new phenomena with a vocabulary that's widely, I mean, it's all over the place. Some people call them coins. Some people call it a currency. Some people call it digital money, whatever. So
what do you call it?
So, well, and this gives rise to why I started writing about it, because I'm thinking from the proprietarian and intellectual property mindset. And when I hear people say that you own your Bitcoin, okay, they make these statements, you own your Bitcoin. Now, I believe, as Mises did, he's got a great chapter or so on this in Socialism, where he talks about ownership, of de jure ownership and de facto ownership. He doesn't really go into this actually in Human Action. I'm not sure why he didn't carry it over, but it's a great discussion. It distinguishes between, in the world of human action, resources or things that we do in the world that are, say, de facto, that are real, things that we can use to accomplish things, and then the oughts or the shoulds or the norms, things that legal rights protect. So he makes a distinction between, say, legal rights and, I guess, natural rights, right, or rights, oughts that people should have. Or the situation faced by Robinson Crusoe on a desert island, he's got a series of means at his disposal. He can do certain things with it. But when society enters the picture and other people enter the picture, then we start talking about what you should do, what the law should be, who should be able to control these things. So there's a distinction. So there's a distinction between actual ownership, in a sense, which is what most people, I think of, to be honest. So when you have your typical Bitcoin enthusiast saying, I own this Bitcoin, they're not speaking like a lawyer would, like I would, right? Or even like a careful political theorist would. They don't mean that there's a legally recognized right to own that Bitcoin. In fact, they never carefully define what the Bitcoin is, which is part of the problem, so which I was grappling with. What they mean is this is a workable system, and I have the practical ability to change that ledger entry in Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin to me is a distributed ledger. It's a ledger distributed across a bunch of decentralized servers around the world with a certain protocol, a certain set of rules for people that want to participate in that scheme or that game or that ledger system. So a Bitcoin is just a way that we describe metaphorically the way that this system works. We can use the metaphor a Bitcoin to refer to one entry in a series of units, right, which are defined by the scheme. So it's basically one of a unique number of finite entries in this ledger scheme, and the ledger scheme is maintained in identical copies of the blockchain stored on many people's computers around the world. So that's a fine way to use metaphors to understand the way a system works. But then people start thinking of the Bitcoin as a thing that can be owned. Now, when I hear the word ownership as a lawyer and as a libertarian, I think of legal ownership. That means the right to control. It doesn't mean the practical ability to control. It means the right to control. In fact, those things are separate. In the law, we distinguish possession from ownership. Possession is, in a sense, the practical ability to use a thing. Ownership is the legally recognized right to use a thing, and they can be different. So, for example, if you own a car, you have both the practical ability to use it and you have the legally recognized right to use it. But if someone steals the car from you, for that period of time when you don't have the car, someone else has the possession of the car and you have the ownership of it still. It doesn't do you much good unless that claim of ownership could result in you recapturing your car or getting a payment, a restitution for it. So analytically, we have to distinguish these things, okay? So when I hear a Bitcoin enthusiast say, I own my Bitcoin, I was prone to say, well, no, you don't own the Bitcoin. And they take that as an insult or as a criticism of the system. They think I'm being a Bitcoin detractor. And I'm not. I'm actually a Bitcoin proponent. I think it's an amazing system. And it emulates, it's designed as a system to emulate features of property rights. Just like if you play the game Monopoly, there's a finite amount of fake dollars there. They're designed to make the game work according to the ways people want to play it. But it doesn't mean they're really dollars. It doesn't mean they're really money. It's just the rules of an internal system that people have adopted and agreed to participate in for their own benefit. I'm not disparaging it all by saying that. That is just the truth. But as a lawyer and as a libertarian, look, there's a saying in the law that a right without a remedy is hollow, which means it's not really a right. In other words, if all you can do is say I have a right to have angels watch over me or something like that, but it's just a saying, it doesn't amount to anything, it's really not a real right. A real right is something that's legitimately and practically enforceable in a given social system, right? A given society. It has an effect. It has a consequence. And therefore, when someone says I have a right to something, as a lawyer, as a libertarian, I think, well, okay, if you say you own Bitcoin number 212, what does that mean in actual legal terms? If you have an ownership of that Bitcoin, what that means is you could go to a court, even in a private society, and they could issue a ruling saying you own this Bitcoin instead of person number C. But who would the ruling be issued against? Let's say C is long gone. Someone stole your password, and they used that password or your encryption key to transfer 100 of your Bitcoins in your account to someone else to pay for something. Let's say because someone else is now C. Person C is an innocent person who is selling widgets on Amazon. You paid him. The thief, the so-called thief, stole my Bitcoins and paid for this item from person C using my Bitcoins. Now, if I get a ruling from a court saying I own the Bitcoins, well, I guess that means C is in possession of my stolen Bitcoins. Similar to a case where if I own a watch and someone steals it from me and sells it at a pawn shop and person C ends up buying it, even if the thief is long gone, right? Theoretically, under regular property law, if I find the person C who bought the watch, even if he's a good faith buyer, he didn't mean any harm, I can get my watch back because of property rights. I own the watch. My ownership never ceased. I still own the watch. I can get it back. If you say Bitcoin is ownable, the same situation would have to apply. There would have to be a legal mechanism where someone makes some kind of order or a decree or a declaration saying, I own that Bitcoin. Now, what does that mean? If Bitcoin is just an entry in a distributed ledger, a ledger that's distributed and kept in information across many people's computers, well, what does that mean that some random person in Bangladesh who has a copy of the blockchain now has an obligation to open up his computer and make an entry change in the way his magnetic hard drives are pointing information around? Do you follow me? So this is the problem. So to my mind, owning a Bitcoin is analogous or similar or basically identical to owning reputation rights, which Rothbard criticized in The Ethics of Liberty. If you own a reputation right, it means you have a property right in other people's brains because your reputation is what people think about you. So if you have a property right in your reputation, that means you have a right to force people to change their minds, right? If you have a property right in a Bitcoin, you have the right to use force to force people to change their Bitcoin blockchain entries on their own servers. And I don't see how you get that right. This is the problem. There's no contract. See, this is the point. The distinction between your bank account at Chase Bank down the street or your website account with GoDaddy, you have contracts with all these people. If someone uses your password to infiltrate your account, they're actually committing trespass because they're using someone's property without their consent. They're using the bank's property without their consent, or they're using GoDaddy's servers without their consent, or they're using whatever I own, my money in the bank, without my consent. Okay, just like if I leave my door open on accident to my house or unlocked, it doesn't mean that someone who walks into my house just because they can, right? Just because the door's unlocked, doesn't mean they have a property right to use my house or to take things from my house. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you have the right to. It depends upon the consent of the owner. But all this presupposes the owner is an owner of something that they own, right? Like Chase Bank owns its bank facilities and its servers. GoDaddy owns its physical servers, and so on. Bitcoin, as I understand it, is set up on purpose to be a quasi or pseudo-anonymous system where there are no contracts required. There's no terms of a service that you have to click on, I agree to the following, in order to make a transaction. It's just a scheme that some people are following, and the scheme determines who owns or who has the right to control a given Bitcoin entry in that ledger. And if someone steals or even guesses my password and they use that to enter that data into the blockchain network and causes all these thousands of people around the world to agree to change and update their pointers in their system at the same time, or roughly the same time, then they're doing that voluntarily, and I don't have the right to make them undo that, which would be the implication of me owning Bitcoin. So this is actually all background, to be honest, Albert, to why the issue came up of how do you explain this and where the real dilemma is. So in a way, everything I've said so far is kind of background on what I really wanted to get to.
Okay, just let me pull a little bit more out of this, though. So basically what you're saying is the absence of contracts here is the issue, and if you added that additional feature, would this whole problem go away?
I think
problem
if
of
you
ownership?
added contracts, it would be different, but even there, so let's take an example of a system that would be analogous to what Bitcoin could look like if you added a contract, which I don't think it should. So let's take a domain name system or a private network. Let's take the AOL network early in its infancy, right? Or you can take a free one like a Blogger that was giving out free domains, right? If I register a website, let's say I register a free blog with Blogspot. This might be a better example. I call it Kinsella's Rants, kinsellasrants.blogspot.com, because they allow me to register that. Now, you could look at that domain, kinsellasrants.blogspot.com. You could say that's a scarce resource and I own it. Okay. I might even have a contract with Blogger or Blogspot about that. But does that really mean I own a domain? You can say that in sort of casual language. You can say it in practical language. I have the practical control over that domain. But as a reality, the domain is just an identifier that points people to a certain website, right, which is on the internet or on this private network, even if it's a private network, like in the early days of AOL. That's a contract. But then the question is always, who owns what, right? So if I have data, private data in a certain section of the AOL servers, okay, that basically means AOL has rented to me by contract the temporary or whatever limited use of some of their physical property, their servers. Okay, so they own their servers. It's a physical thing that they own. It's patterned in a certain way with data that I've uploaded to it with their permission. That's a contract. Okay. So the contract would govern who owns ownable things. The ownable things are still scarce resources. The entire world is made of hardware in a sense, right? The entire internet is made of hardware. There are wires. Someone owns the wires, right? There are fiber optic cables. Someone owns those cables. There are satellites, and there's servers, and then there's transmission nodes, and there's switches. All these things are owned by someone, and then they all connect together by various interoperability agreements, right, where they agree to cooperate with each other and link up together, just like two roads might link up together. So it always comes down to a question of who owns what and of what ownable things. So in the Bitcoin case, or let's take a credit card case. Now, these examples having to do with modern money are complicated because the government has screwed up money so much, and money today is not what money used to be. Money used to be basically some commodity like gold, which was ownable. And then the question was, who owns the piece of gold, right? Whether it's held by a bank or held by a lender or whatever. But now money doesn't, in a sense, fiat money, dollars issued by the government, are no more real than Bitcoins are. They're just
I was going to say that. Yeah.
yeah, they're very similar to Bitcoin, except in Bitcoin there's no fraud involved and there's no coercion involved. In the current fiat money system, it's used voluntarily in a sense, but only because the country has no choice because of legal tender laws and other forms of coercion that the state imposes upon us. So the state has basically taken an existing quasi-natural money system and gradually using the, like the Mises regression idea, they've built upon that and they've gradually cut the tide of gold to now we're to the point where we have fiat money units. And people sometimes say, well, you can own a piece of paper and $1 is a piece of paper. Well, I imagine you and I know that $1 is not a piece of paper. There are billions of dollars out there that are not on pieces of paper. They're just units in some government-maintained ledger system, in effect.
Right. Now, in this case, you're saying that the contract with the banks is what makes these units ownable? Or
honestly, if you want to be technically precise, I would be skeptical of saying dollars are ownable right now. However, if I have control of a certain number of dollars of this government, shaky government system, I don't want someone else to be able to transfer them away, just like I don't want someone to take my 100 Bitcoins away from me, right? I want to have practical control of that so I can spend it or use it or keep it. And so but I do have a contract with Chase Bank, let's say. At least I could. I think it's at least an implicit contract. At least there's a property there. They own their facilities. They own their computer systems. And when I log into my Chase account, I enter a password and I can manipulate funds around that system. Whether those particular funds are technically ownable under a libertarian scheme is sort of a far-field question because you wouldn't have such a money system in a free society anyway. So that is sort of an anomaly. However, I do think that there's implicitly a contract between me and Chase, and there's a contract between Chase and any scammer who walks in their front door and pretends to be me. So this is why people say if you're against intellectual property, you can't be against identity theft. And I'm like, of course you can. Well, you can't really steal someone's identity, but when people say identity theft, what they mean is that you're using deception to gain access to my resources. Just like if I'm out of town for a month and I have some housekeeper or some staff at my home and someone walks up and they pretend like they're me and they deceive the housekeeper or the guard or whatever into letting me into the home, just because they get away with it doesn't mean it's not an act of trespass. They are actually in my home, using my home without my consent. Even if my door is wide open, if they walk into my house without my permission, they're using my home without my consent. That's a type of trespass, a type of aggression. Okay. Same thing in the bank situation. If someone goes into Chase Bank and they pretend to be me, they're deceiving the bank. They're using the bank's resources without their permission. And the bank is in violation of their contract with me because they surely made a contract with me. We promise to you we will have adequate security measures in place, that we will not let some scammer come and take the money that's in your account. And if we do, then we're on the hook for it. So there is a contractual network that you can envision there, and that is there.
Okay, I want to ask you one more question.
Exist. Sorry, go ahead.
Before we move on, this is a good background, but we have a lot to get into. But I just want to say the fact that Mises left this out of human action, this insight, is interesting because if he had included it, wouldn't he have to address the question of does money have to be ownable in a legal sense? Or did he address that in the earlier work?
Well, what he left out of human action was this very interesting discussion in socialism of how property rights arise in the first place, and how he distinguishes between basically physical control, what I would call possession. He calls it something like de facto ownership, and de jure ownership or legal ownership, which I would call just ownership, because ownership to me implies a right, which is a legal thing. So it's just a terminology thing. I'm not sure why he left it out of human action. It seems like he would have incorporated that in there. I don't see any reason to believe he rejected that. As for the money theorem, I just don't think he ever conceived of anything digital, right, or anything that wouldn't be a commodity, that wouldn't have arose as money. My personal view from reading Mises, and I am not an Austrian economist, I'm just a appreciating outside admiring student. I think his regression theorem does not prove that money has to arise from a commodity, and I don't think it meant to prove that. I think he was trying to overcome the criticism that there's a circularity, right? There's a circularity in the idea that money like gold or something can have value. And he invented his regression theorem as a way to show that it doesn't have to be a circularity. It's not a bootstrapping problem because you can trace the value of money evolutionarily back day from day until the time that it was solely a commodity with only a commodity value, which is almost certainly how money actually, in broad form, arose in the real world. So he was only imagining, well, here's how money really did arise, and if it did arise this way, logically, there's no infinite regress, basically. Right?
If we just substitute the word commodity with direct use good, doesn't it solve the problem?
It might, but then we have to talk about what the word good means. And then you get into a whole nother Austrian issue and potential libertarian issue, because the word good is another vague term for legal purposes, because you'll have intellectual property advocates say something like, well, if I can sell my labor on the market, that's a good because it has a value, right? And therefore, someone can own it. You couldn't sell it if you didn't own it. So you'll get these kind of fallacious arguments if you're not careful with even those terms, like the term good. So economically, I have no problem calling it a good. But it's when you start assuming that just because something is valued – look, I think if you keep the Misesian concept of subjective value in mind, it helps avoid a lot of these mistakes.
Right.
When we say something is –
Go ahead. Sorry. I was just going to say value satisfying is what I mean by good, right? Something that satisfies a want.
But all that means is that, well, if you think about the general structure of human action, all human action is aimed at an end. That is something the actor wants to achieve in the future, necessarily in the future. So basically they forecast or they envision a future world that's going to happen without their intervention, and they don't like it. They don't like it compared to what they think could happen. So they come up with ways they can affect the course of action. That's called means. They employ means which causally interfere with the course of things, right? They're trying to achieve a different outcome. That outcome is their goal or their end. Now, that outcome could be any number of things. The outcome could be the ownership of an object. Like if I want a new television, I will go to the market and purchase a television, right? That's the end of my action. The end of my action is the ownership of an object. Or the object could be to have a new pair of shoes. And maybe the means to attain that is to employ my labor with my leather, right, and some other resources I have at hand, and make a pair of shoes by hand. That's the outcome, the end of my action. But the end of my action may be something that's not ownable, right, which is what people lose sight of. They're all valued. The outcome, the end of my action may be to, have a county fair arranged where everyone's happy for a month. It may be to get a girl to give me a kiss, or it may be to make friends with someone, or it may be to read a novel. There's any number of things I want to do, and when I achieve them, that's called profit, right? I have a profitable or successful action, and I've made a psychic profit, and I demonstrated that I valued it because I pursued it. But it doesn't mean that I've necessarily achieved something that I own, right? If a girl gives me a smile, if I tell a story and people smile and clap, it doesn't mean I've acquired ownership of some new thing that's ownable. So we have to realize that just because we value things in our actions doesn't mean that things that so-called have value are economic goods that can be traded and sold in the sense that there's an ownership title to those things. We have to make a distinction. And I think that's what people lose sight of, especially in intellectual property. So the common argument is that, well, obviously people value ideas because they will sometimes pay you to give you an idea. In other words, I will offer to pay you money for you to give information to me that I desire to have from you. So that proves that I value you giving me information. That is true. I totally agree with that. It doesn't prove that just because you, quote, sold it to me means that you owned it. See, they can't get around this metaphor that's used with the idea of a sale. They think that if you sell something, quotes around the word thing, you had to own the thing. They are too locked into the framework of a traditional sale of a movable, or of an ownable object, a scarce resource, an ownable object. It is true that sometimes we have exchange like that. You give me $1 or you give me a gold coin, I give you my sheep. In that case, there's an exchange of things. So the end of the actions of both parties in those cases is to come to own something they didn't own before. But as I said, the end of all action is not ownership of a thing, right? And if I pay you to sing a song for my daughter's birthday party, I am transferring money to you, and you do desire to, as the end of your action, right? Your goal is to acquire ownership of this coin, okay? My goal is to achieve my daughter's happiness by having someone sing at her party. And once that event passes, I'm satisfied, it's happened, but I don't own anything. I didn't acquire ownership of anything. So that's an example of a contract where, and now we can describe in metaphorical terms, we can say you sold your singing services. That's fine. You can use that terminology. But it does not mean that you own your singing services. It doesn't mean you own your singing ability. This is where the problem arises with the overuse of metaphors and the imprecise use of language.
Okay, so in that case, you own your body. And if, for instance, you were to purchase, if you were to contract with me for me to give you a password, which would be maybe, I don't know, a 16-bit pseudo-random code, you would just be paying me to manipulate my body in a way that satisfied that value, right? So you'd be paying me to write something down or paying me to recite a sequence, but you wouldn't be buying the sequence.
I think you can call it buying the sequence, but it's not like legally precise. Okay, it's fine to describe it that way because economically that's the goals of the actors, and we can use metaphors and analogies to describe the interaction between these people. If you look at Rothbard's title transfer theory of contract, which I agree with, which views contracts as simply the exercise of control of a resource that's owned by the owner instead of as binding promises, then this all follows naturally. In the case you described, what's going on is that someone wants information that they can use for some practical purpose. Like if there's a scheme in effect, the Bitcoin scheme in effect, the way it's set up is someone's got to have a certain key or password to make a certain change in the blockchain happen. Okay, but someone else has that information and it's confidential. It's only in their head or stored somewhere in their private property that they have access to, right? And you need to induce them to give you this information. You want to encourage them to perform an action with the resources that they own, namely their body and any other resources they have they need to manipulate to get you this data. So you want the data. You want to, quote, buy the data. But what that really means is you're willing to make a contract where you say, listen, I hereby give you $100, okay? Now, let's assume dollars is an ownable thing. Let's say $100 means, 200 ounces of silver or whatever, right? 2,000 ounces of silver. I hereby give to you this title to this owned resource if you perform the following action, which is giving me information that I want, right? And if that happens, that's a mutually useful exchange, but technically speaking, it's not really an exchange of titles. It's an exchange economically because both sides benefit from it. But I'm just using this conditional title transfer of my money to induce the other person to use his property in a way that I find pleasing to me, which means he opens his mouth and he gives me useful information that I can then go use as part of some other network to do something else that I want to do, right?
Okay.
So
go
ahead.
That sounds a lot like, for instance, someone giving you a violin lesson, right? Giving you the information that you can use. So let's get to the meat of it then. And what is the new insight or what is the new angle that you're bringing now that might help?
So trying to explain, which I've sort of done here. Why I think it's a misnomer to say that Bitcoin is ownable, right? And again, the reason is because Bitcoin is just information stored in different people's computers. And if you own the information, that really means you own their computers. But you don't even have a contract with anyone. So you don't have any contractual right to their computers, etc. So discussing this, trying to explain it to people, I had people trying to make analogies to the intellectual property argument to try to navigate and figure out this Bitcoin thing. And some of them, a common argument, and I've made the argument this way before myself, an argument for why copyright, for example, is not legitimate is that it tries to grant property rights in information, but information, unlike scarce resources, has this property that is infinitely replicable or infinitely copyable. And I agree with that. But I think that sort of misses an intermediate step. And that is the following. If you think more closely about this, property rights are the rights to control, right? The legally recognized, socially recognized right to control or to use a given scarce resource that is a thing that's of the type that people could have a conflict over it. If there was no possibility of conflict over these things, you wouldn't need property rules in the first place. We'd all be living in a Garden of Eden. That's the whole reason for property rights. And
is this universally accepted?
I don't think it's – I think it has – to a degree, I think it is universally accepted. I mean, the very institution of property rights is widespread around the world. It's not consistently put in place. And I would say pretty much all libertarians recognize that there ought to be property rights in these kinds of scarce resources. And, the funny thing is, if you imagine a dog, which is a stupid animal, even dogs recognize kind of a temporary limited property right in their dog bowl. If they're eating out of their dog bowl and another dog approaches, they're going to growl. And because there's a possibility of conflict, because there's only so much food in the bowl, they can't both eat the food, right? This is a common sense, almost undeniable feature of what property rights are.
For some people, that'll be the most objectionable thing you've said so far. So, picking on dogs.
Could be.
Okay, continue,
yes,
please.
I love my dogs. I'm looking at two smart poodles right now, but they're unintelligent in the sense of conceptual, rational beings.
Okay.
I'm just saying even dogs can recognize, although I agree. I would take my poodles over some socialists any day. There's a line by Mike Masnick or someone. No, not Mike Masnick. Someone else. He says that even birds don't try to copyright their songs or something. They just sing them freely. But when you ask about why information, which is what the idea of IP is property rights in information, why information is not ownable, it's not exactly because it's replicable. Let's go back a second. Information, as by the way, the proponents of intellectual property often point out, they will often say, well, I agree with you that only scarce resources can be owned, but information is always stored on something physical, right? It's always some arrangement of bits or atoms somewhere. And I think they're actually correct. Information is not a free-floating thing. We don't live in a Platonic universe where there's ideas just floating around out there. Information is always embodied in some kind of substrate or medium. Even if it's in a signal being transmitted from Mars to the Earth in an electromagnetic wave, it's some kind of perturbation of the EM fields, which is some kind of scarce resource itself because you can only use the bandwidth so much, etc. But usually it's stored, and in copyright law, it says that there's a copyright in original works by an author, fixed in a tangible medium of expression. This is what copyright law is. So even copyright law recognizes that you have to fix it. You can't just tell a story at a party and claim a copyright in that story. You have to fix it in a tangible medium of expression, which means you have to write it down. You got to record it somewhere. You got to store it somewhere, right? Which is how information works. All information is stored somewhere. Even if it's a memory, it's in your brain. It's some kind of impatterning of the neurons in your brain. But typically it's like ink on paper or a carving on a tree, right? Or a paint on a cave wall, right? Or the impatterning or the way that the pits and the ledges of a CD are put on there by a laser, which puts zeros and ones on there, which some other device can read and get information back out of. Information is always stored, in a sense, on some physical medium. I assume you'd agree with that. I don't.
Yeah, and you sound very much like a patent attorney.
Yeah. And
yeah.
But the thing is, guess what? These physical mediums are ownable, scarce things. Someone owns them already. Okay? So the problem I'm getting to is what I call double counting. And you see this in lots of areas of political theory and even libertarian talk. You'll have, for example, to take a slight digression, someone say that they own their labor. Okay? Now, I disagree with this. I understand what they're saying, but to me, they're double counting. What they're saying is they own their body. Okay? And that's fine. If you want to say you own your body and you want to word it by saying you own your labor, that's a way of putting it. I don't have a strong problem with that. But if you say, okay, I own my labor, which to my mind means I own my body and that gives me the ability to control my body as I see fit and to labor as I see fit. You might as well say I own my actions. I own what I do. Okay,
I was just going to say that. I own my free will, right?
Yeah, or you could say I own my wife because she's my wife. You know, the word "my" is there; it's a possessive after all, right? I mean, or I own my memories, or I own my age. It's my age. You know, I'm 49.8. That's my age. It is my age. I guess I own it. I mean, there's no end to these metaphorical ways of putting things, right? But my point is, if you ask someone who says they own their labor, well, do you own your body? They'll say yes. I'll say, so do you own your body and your labor? And quite often they'll say, yeah, I own my body and my labor. Now, to me, that's like saying I own my head and I own my brain and I own my thoughts in my brain. I mean, you keep adding these things and you end up double counting. And the same thing happens with labor, by the way. So like a Randian will say, I created a new value. So that's the whole theory of rights for Randy is the creation of what they call values, like a noun. They think of things as values, by which they mean something that you value. So they sort of skip the Austrian subjectivist aspect of it, or they kind of bury it. I'll say, well, let's give me an example. Like if I make a new mousetrap, yes, that's a value. Okay. But I own the mousetrap because I actually had to own the wood and the metal that I made it from already. So when I rearrange these materials into a new mousetrap, I own the mousetrap because I already owned the constituent materials that went into it, right? Yes. And you created a value and you own that value. I'm like, no, it's like, no, I don't. You don't say I have to say, and I own that value. The value is the mousetrap, but I own the mousetrap because I own the materials that went into it. And if I didn't own the materials, the raw materials that went into it, I don't own it. Like if I'm a factory worker and I'm making traps for this owner, I don't own the mousetrap that I'm making. You see, so what they try to do is they try to identify features of objects and they try to separate them from the objects. And they try to say they're both ownable. So I own my body and I own my actions. Well, but owning my body just means that I have the ability and the right to perform what actions I want to do with it. To say I own my body and my actions is a weird type of double counting, which can get you into trouble, especially if you use the word value or labor instead of actions, because now we get to the labor theory of value. I own which is what Locke did with the labor theory of property and what Karl Marx and the others did with the labor theory of value. They start thinking of labor as this substance that you own, right? Which they never would do if they keep straight in their minds the fact that you own the scarce resource of your body. That gives you the right, the ability to perform labor as you see fit. That is true. Okay? But it doesn't mean you own your labor as a separate thing that's independently ownable. When you start thinking like that, when you start double counting, you start thinking of labor as a substance that's ownable. And guess what? If you mix this substance that you own, this kind of ethereal substance with things in the world that are unowned, you acquire this mystical tendril of connections to it. You own it now because you've mixed your labor, which you own your labor. Never see labor. It's never weighable. You can never measure it, right? And then the Marxians start saying, well, it's exploitation, right? If you don't pay someone if you make profit off of one of your employees because the labor they mixed They own their labor, and it goes into these products they made for you. So you're exploiting them. You're stealing from them. You're stealing their labor from them. You're effectively enslaving people by employing them. So basically, this convoluted way of thinking, this imprecise way of thinking, leads people to come to the exact opposite conclusion that common sense would lead you to. That is, offering to give someone something you don't owe them if they will do a service for you is stealing from them or exploiting. So it's completely backwards. So I think the way to look at this is step back and say, it's not really the fact that information is replicable, which is why it's not a scarce resource, it's not ownable. It's that information, just like Bitcoins, right? What is a Bitcoin? It's just the arrangement of information, or it's the arrangement of material that someone else owns, right? Information has to be stored on a substrate, on a carrier. Intellectual property tries to grant property rights in ideas. But what are ideas? Again, ideas are knowledge or information which is always stored in some underlying owned thing. And therefore, let's just consider an object that most people would uncontroversially agree is ownable and should be ownable. Like, let's say a red billiards ball. Okay, so here we have a red billiards ball. Let's say it was manufactured in the year 1985. Okay, so now we have a 30-year-old billiards ball. It's got a certain size, it's got a certain color, it's got a certain weight, right? It's got a certain. It could even have a little. It could have a pattern of information etched upon it somewhere. You could have, it could have the Bible actually etched into it somewhere. So it could have information in pattern into it, right? So we have an object that has an owner. Now this object is describable by many of its features, right? Or characteristics, or what you could call properties, right? One of the properties or features of this ball is its diameter. One is its mass. One is its age. Okay? One is its composition, right? One is its degree of perfect sphericity. I don't know what the word for that is. One is its color. It could be bright red. These are all features of, and another one is the information in pattern onto its outer surface. There could be a nice saying or the Bible or whatever on there. These are features of the object that are owned. And this is why I mentioned the double counting point. It is true that you own the ball, and that means you own everything about the ball. But it doesn't mean that you own these features as some kind of separate metaphysical thing. You don't own the color of the ball in some general sense. You don't own redness. You don't own the age of the ball. If you did, that would mean that you have a property right in every other, I guess, thing in the universe that's exactly 30.1 years old or whatever the age is. You would have a property right in everything in the universe that has this exact sphericity and this exact mass and this exact diameter, right? Or that looks like this ball. And that is the problem with intellectual property. And that's the problem with treating Bitcoin as property, in my opinion.
Okay, but hold on for a second. I don't know anyone who supports IP that would claim that they own all of those things separate. They would claim that they own the combination, this unique and original combination of characteristics.
Well, not the whole thing, though, right? So what they usually do, they isolate one set of features of the object. So let's take a book as a better example. So they'll say that they own the book and they own the way the book is patterned, right? The way the ink patterns are on the book. That's where the information has to be stored, right? So what they're saying is any other object that's in patterned the same way, they have a property right in that object, even though that other object is another physical thing that has another owner, right? So this is the fundamental problem. So here's what I'm saying. Information is one of the features of some owned object. It's not the only feature. It's one of the ones that's more easily copyable. So, for example, if I see a book that someone else owns, it's pretty easy for me to make another book using my own resources that has a similar pattern of information on it. So in that sense, information is a feature of an object that happens to be easily replicable. But other features of the book may not be easily replicable. So, for example, the age of the book. Let's say it's the oldest book that we've ever found. It's 1,500 years old or something like that. I can't make a new book that's 1,500 years old. I just can't do that. Logically, I guess you could, but I can't see how you can do it. So that's a feature that you couldn't easily replicate. Okay, the weight of the book. I guess I could make an object that has the same weight as that book. So certain features of objects are easily replicable and certain features are not. But the point is, whatever the feature is, it's a feature of an owned resource, and a property right is not violated by someone else having another resource that has similar features in some respects. This is the very problem of IP, is that it all goes back to this double counting, and it goes back to a mistaken idea. And this is why when people talk about Bitcoin, they say, well, Bitcoins exist. You know, they use the word exist. It's like, well, to my mind, it's sort of a recovering Randian who appreciates her epistemology. When they say it exists, what they're trying to say is there is a conceptual term that we found to identify an operation of this phenomena, and the term is Bitcoin, and that helps us format our thinking. It's a valid concept. It has a referent in reality. It describes something that's actually going on. It's a legitimate concept. It's an accurate way of describing what's going on. So when they use the word Bitcoins exist, what they mean is there's really a phenomena out there, and this is the way to understand what's happening. We're going to use this word Bitcoin and this concept Bitcoin to format our understanding of what's going on, right? But people get trapped into this, well, I've just come up with a valid concept, a valid way of understanding the way the universe works in this one little area. And so I'm going to attach the word exist to this. That's my grunting way of saying this is a valid concept. It's an accurate description of reality. So I'm going to say blah exist, you know, like so because blah exist, which is my way of grunting out that I've come up with a useful way of describing what's going on. The blah must be ownable. I mean, this is basically the reasoning of these people. They go from conceptualization, the fact that there are legitimate concepts, to whatever word I can slap on something that's a useful way of describing reality must point to something out there that is ownable. But the problem is, quite often, the thing they're pointing to is a feature of an object that is itself ownable. And the thing is already owned. The features cannot be independently owned.
Okay.
This is that's basically the point.
Your frustration, does a lot of it stem from the fact that you're having these discussions with people who aren't sort of versed in IP law or just legal concepts to begin with? Would you be having the same discussions to the same extent with your colleagues, for instance?
No, and I don't mean well, okay, so there are no colleagues, basically, is the problem. And the reason is, and no, I'm not frustrated with people. I understand their confusion. Look, I mean, I've been struggling with this myself for a long time, and this is the way my thinking wins its way to try to find a way to assemble this stuff that you can see where you can feel there's a gnawing problem that everyone has, and they're not quite getting it right. And the one way you can tell that is everyone uses conflicting terminology. You'll have one Bitcoin advocate say, no, you don't own the Bitcoins, you own the coins. And I'm like, well, what the hell are the coins? And then another will say, no, you don't own the Bitcoins, you own the encryption key. I'm like, well, that's information on your computer, and you already own your computer, so how can you own a key? And others say, no, it's because you have an implicit contract with. I'm like, well, where is the contract? What are the terms? So you can see they're going around in circles, and I totally understand that. I'm not frustrated really at all. I guess if I'm frustrated with mainstreamers, because your libertarians are typically not legal experts. They don't understand the legal conceptual framework, which to my mind makes a lot of these errors clear more early or more easily visible. The people that understand legal theory, they don't have a good libertarian principled framework at all. So in other words, people that understand legal theory aren't principled and don't care. And the people that care or confused about this emerging thing, but partly because they're not libertarian legal theorist experts. So I wouldn't say I'm frustrated with them at all. I am frustrated a little bit with people that are too cocksure about these things. Even I try to be cocksure about it because this is an emerging thing. It's not easy. I think it'd be fine to discuss things in a rational way, to ask questions, to gnaw on these things around the edges. But for people to just come out cocksure with these statements, which you can tell right away they haven't thought it all through. And they're just making assertions which they cannot back up. Or they haven't defined their terms carefully enough where you can even know whether they're right or wrong, which is always a sign of someone who is kind of a loose cannon. So no, I don't mean to sound frustrated. I'm not. I think it's a difficult puzzle, but it's one that's important, and we have to try to solve it somehow. And we can only do it honestly and by being aware of the nature of what we're really talking about and its implications for other parts of libertarian theory and for intersocial human cooperation.
You alluded to this earlier, actually, but I think part of the problem is your comments are being construed as an attack, a direct attack on Bitcoin, where that's not the case.
Yes, I think some people think when you say Bitcoins can't be owned. See, I think they're thinking in practical terms, like ownership to them means just a practical system that works and they have control over the Bitcoins. And of course, I wouldn't deny that because I've had people send Bitcoins to me and I've sent Bitcoins to others. So I know that there is the way you can use a system to change these ledger entries, right? There's a way to do it. But that's not what ownership means. I don't think they have an appreciate, and it's partly my fault because when I say no, it's not ownership, I'm going back to the legal interpretation of ownership, and not just legal. I mean, this is part of libertarian theory. It's important to make a distinction. It's important to make a distinction between might and right. It's important to make a distinction between is and should. It's important to make a distinction between the de facto situation and the preferred rightful situation, right? It's important to make a distinction between economic possession and between social cooperation and rights, because you need the former to analyze human action per se, like Robinson Crusoe on a desert island would take action. He would employ or possess scarce means. Now, these people might say he owns if he finds some resource that he's using, he owns those resources. I think that's imprecise. We need to reserve the word ownership for a social situation. Robinson Crusoe has no need for property rights. And ownership to me is linked in with property rights. The property rights make no sense and cannot exist, whatever the word exist means in that case, with someone alone on a desert island. Property rights are always rights against another person, and they always control the legitimate ability to use a particular resource that the two or more people in this society could potentially have conflict over.
Okay, and one more question. We're going long here, so one more question before I wrap up. If you were going to write your book or revise your book against intellectual property, I'm wondering where would this double counting fit in? Would it be just kind of supporting commentary, or would it be more? Supporting.
No, okay. I don't think it would radically revise it. It would be supporting. I would also be a little bit more. Maybe I might revise some of my wording on the word scarcity and make clear to people that it has to do with rivalrousness, not just lack of abundance. I also probably would bring in this negative servitude idea I've used before, which complements what we've talked about today. And I've got a whole blog post on that. But in short, the negative servitude idea is a way of legally classifying the nature of intellectual property rights, which is it shows that what an intellectual property right is, it's what we call a negative servitude or a negative easement. It's basically a legal right for some person to use state or legal force against someone else to prohibit them from using their own resources that they legitimately own in a given way. And that is an accepted legal classification in law called negative servitude. which you would see, for example, in a restrictive covenant, like in a neighborhood where everyone agrees that you can't paint your house purple. Okay, that's a negative servitude. And a negative servitude is perfectly legitimate if it's contractually agreed to. That's why people do it. But if the government simply announced one day that person A has the right to veto how everyone else in his neighborhood paints their house, the government would be granting a negative servitude to A without the consent of the burdened estates. That would be a taking of property, and that's exactly what IP does. Copyright and patent are negative servitudes whereby the government grants to someone who registers some claim with the state saying, I've come up with a new copyright song, I've come up with a new invention, and the government says, okay, we're going to give you the right to veto how others use their existing owned resources. That is a negative servitude. The problem with it is it's involuntary. The people who are burdened by it never agreed to that. So this is really the essence of the problem of patents and copyrights, or that's one way to explain it. And I did not have that in my original book. So I would add that, and I would add this double counting stuff too as another way to illustrate the dangers of IP.
Okay, my guest has been Stephan Kinsella, patent attorney. You can find him at c4sif.org. I believe I have that correct. Is there any other website or, for instance, a podcast you want to mention?
Well, I have c4sif.org is where I put a lot of my intellectual property related material. My general website, stephankinsella.com, has all of my books and articles, and I have a podcast there too, which I'll run this podcast on when you release it.
Okay, great. And I'll link to that on the show notes. Thank you very much for joining me for this in-depth and extended conversation. I really enjoyed it. And please visit my website at powerandmarket.com. Until next time, take care.